Maeva carried the child for nearly a year, 11 agonizing months. In the cliffside enclave of Oakhaven, that kind of delay gave the gossips plenty to chew on. They'd sit by the docks, gutting fish and muttering about cursed wombs. When the labor finally hit, it didn't just rain. The sky tore itself apart. Thunder rattled the floorboards of their small cabin. Inside, Maeva was screaming, gripping the hands of Aurelia, the oldest and most trusted healer in the territory. When the baby finally slipped into the world, the room went dead silent. The infant, whom they named Ilara, wasn't formed like the other village girls. She carried the anatomy of both a boy and a girl. Maeva's husband, Kalen, backed against the wooden wall, his face drained of blood. He knew exactly what this harsh world did to things it couldn't understand. Pure panic set in. He grabbed Aurelia by her soaked shoulders, his voice breaking. "You saw nothing," Kalen pleaded, practically begging the old woman. "I'll give you the orchard down by the river, the whole plot. Just swear to me on your life, Aurelia. You tell no one." The old woman looked down at the tiny, shivering newborn. She wrapped Ilara tightly in a heavy woolen blanket and nodded slowly. "The child's truth stays in this room," the healer whispered. And just like that, a massive lie was born right alongside the baby, wrapping around Ilara before she could even take her first real breath. Growing up in Oakhaven meant living in each other's pockets, but Ilara mastered the art of vanishing. While the other kids spent their scorching summers plunging into the saltwater swimming holes, tearing off their tunics with careless abandon, Ilara never joined them. She'd linger at the edge of the tree line, watching the splashing water with a heavy, unspoken ache in her chest. "She's just delicate," the women would say, watching her retreat. "Modest to a fault." They had no idea. It wasn't modesty, it was pure survival. If she needed to relieve herself, she'd walk a mile off the beaten path just to ensure absolute privacy. Every rustle of leaves made her flinch. She understood, even at a painfully young age, that her body was a loaded gun waiting to go off. Maeva and Kalen had drilled the fear of discovery deeply into her bones. Ilara learned to navigate the world from a safe distance. She smiled warmly, waved at the rowdy boys covered in mud, but always kept a strict physical barrier between herself and the rest of humanity. Her parents watched from their porch, their hearts constantly sitting in their throats. They were proud of how brilliantly she adapted, sure, but it was a quiet, suffocating kind of pride. Ilara was surviving, but she was entirely alone, forced to build a fortress around a secret she didn't even ask for. Despite the invisible wall she built, the village fell completely in love with her. You couldn't help it. If a stray dog was limping through the market, Ilara was the one tearing up her own petticoat to bandage its bleeding leg. When old man Silas couldn't haul his firewood up the steep hill, he'd turn around to find Ilara quietly carrying the load, her face flushed but smiling brightly. And she was striking, absolutely breathtaking. When she walked through the town square, her dark hair catching the autumn light, people literally stopped what they were doing. The boys tripped over their own feet trying to look at her. The elders whispered that the gods took 11 months to carve her simply because they were making a masterpiece. She soaked in their affection, and it genuinely warmed her, but it also felt like a twisted joke. Ilara desperately wanted to plunge into the river with them, to trade careless secrets by the fire, to just exist without calculating every single movement. She was the most beloved creature in Oakhaven, yet she felt like an imposter wearing a beautiful mask. Her parents saw the way the village worshipped her and finally exhaled, thinking the worst was over. They thought her kindness had bought her permanent safety, but they didn't realize that being the absolute center of attention is the most dangerous place for someone trying to hide. Then came Calum. He was a local shipbuilder's son, all broad shoulders, sun-baked skin, and a laugh that made you want to drop whatever you were doing and join him. When he asked Alara to marry him, kneeling right in the mud of the bustling marketplace, the entire village practically erupted in cheers. She said yes. Her heart wanted him fiercely, even if her mind was screaming in sheer panic. The wedding was absolute chaos in the best way possible. Oakhaven threw everything into it. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar and spiced wine. Fiddles screeched into the early hours of the morning. Alara sat at the head table, draped in white linen and wildflowers, looking like a literal queen. Caleb couldn't take his eyes off her, squeezing her hand under the table, completely drunk on happiness. Everyone kept raising their glasses, shouting about how perfect they were together. But beneath the heavy wooden table, Alara's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold her cup. The feast was winding down. The sky was getting uncomfortably dark. She loved Caleb, she really did. But the terrifying reality of the wedding night was rushing toward her like a runaway carriage. She was about to be completely alone in a room with the man who thought he knew exactly who he was marrying, and she had absolutely no idea how to tell him. Every night after the wedding, Caleb reached for her in the dark. His hands were gentle, full of a deep, simple love that tore her heart right down the middle. Alara would pull away, wrapping the coarse linen sheets tight around her chest. "Not tonight, Caleb," she'd whisper, forcing a smile that felt like shattered glass in her throat. "We have all the time in the world. Let's just wait." Caleb was a good man. He didn't demand, he didn't shout. He'd just kiss her forehead, pull her close, and say, "I'll wait forever, Elle. I love you exactly as you are." But the darkness in the room felt heavy with his unspoken confusion. Alara lay awake, listening to his steady breathing, terrified by her own silence. She wanted to rip the secret out of her chest and hand it to him, to finally breathe freely. But the fear of his reaction, the fear of him looking at her the way she looked at herself, kept her mouth completely clamped shut. Days bled into weeks, and the vibrant, loving energy between them started to stretch thin, pulled tight by a string of polite excuses and unbearable distance. In Oakhaven, a village that breathed gossip, their distance didn't go unnoticed for long. The women washing clothes by the river began to cast sidelong glances at Alara. "A month married and she still walks like a ghost in her own home," they'd murmur, wringing out the wet fabric. Every time Alara walked through the market, the usual warm greetings were replaced by a sharp, inquisitive silence. Caleb felt it too. The weight of the unspoken tension was crushing him. He loved her violently, but the constant rejection was eroding his spirit. One afternoon, unable to carry the confusion anymore, he walked up the steep hill to Maeva and Kayleen's cabin. He stood on their porch, twisting his cap in his hands, looking completely wrecked. "I love her more than my own life," he told her parents, his voice cracking. "But she won't let me near her. She won't let me be a husband to her. Is there something you didn't tell me? Something I did wrong?" Maeva's face drained of color, and Kayleen gripped the edge of the wooden table so hard his knuckles turned white. They were drowning in the same lie they'd built 11 years ago. "Be patient, Caleb," Maeva said, her voice shaking slightly. "She's delicate. She'll come to you when she's ready." Caleb nodded, but he walked away feeling more hollow and desperate than before. Desperation drove Caleb to the village elders. They sat in the great hall, smoking pipes and listening as he spilled his guts, admitting that his marriage was completely unconsummated. He wasn't angry, he was just begging for guidance. But telling the elders in Oakhaven was like throwing a lit match into dry hay. By nightfall, the whispers had mutated into a roar. "They haven't shared a bed," the baker told the blacksmith. "She won't even let him touch her," the seamstress told the butcher. The village, which had previously worshipped Alara, now viewed her as a bizarre, malfunctioning puzzle. The adoration twisted into morbid curiosity. Alara could feel the shift in the air. The marketplace, once her favorite place, became a gauntlet of piercing stares and sudden unnatural silences. Every time she walked past a group of people, she felt their eyes dragging over her body, dissecting her, searching for the flaw that was keeping her husband away. The secret she had buried so deeply was vibrating beneath the surface, threatening to crack Oakhaven wide open. The pressure inside Ilara became unbearable. She felt like she was suffocating under the weight of everyone's eyes. She needed to breathe. She needed just one person in this world to know the truth and not run away. Desperate, she ran to the edge of the village to find Lyra, a girl she had known since childhood, someone whose kindness had always felt genuine and steady. Lyra took one look at Ilara's pale, tear-streaked face and pulled her into the small stone cottage. "Ilara, what is it? You're trembling," Lyra said, wrapping a warm shawl around her shoulders. Ilara paced the floor, her chest heaving. "I have to tell you something, Lyra, but you have to swear it dies with you. You have to swear to me." Lyra nodded, her eyes wide with concern. "I swear it. Tell me." And so, Ilara shattered the silence of a lifetime. She explained everything: the stormy night of her birth, the panic of her parents, the dual nature of her body that made her entirely terrified of Calem's touch. Lyra sat perfectly still, absorbing the colossal weight of the secret. When Ilara finished, she braced herself for the disgust. Instead, Lyra reached out and gripped her hand tight. "You're still Ilara," she whispered fiercely. "You're still the kindest soul in this miserable town." For the first time in her life, Ilara wept not out of fear, but out of sheer, overwhelming relief. But relief in Oakhaven never lasted long. Lyra swore secrecy, but a secret of that magnitude burned a hole straight through her resolve. Overwhelmed by the shocking truth, she whispered it to her mother under the cover of darkness. Her mother whispered it to her sister. By the time the sun reached its peak the next day, the secret had exploded across the entire village. It wasn't a rumor anymore, it was a wildfire. "Both parts," the men sneered by the docks. "A freak of nature," the women hissed at the market. The village that had treated Ilara like royalty now looked at her like she was a monster that had somehow tricked them all. When Calem heard it, the bottom fell out of his world. He didn't feel disgust, he felt utterly and completely betrayed. He had offered her every ounce of his heart, and she had let him stumble around in the dark, humiliated and confused while hiding a truth that changed everything. The love he felt for her tangled violently with the anger of being made a fool. The atmosphere in their small home became violently toxic. The silence that used to be polite was now suffocating and laced with resentment. Every time Calem looked at her, Ilara saw the ghost of the betrayal in his eyes. One evening, staring into the dying embers of the hearth, Calem finally broke the silence. His voice was completely hollow. "I can't do this right now, Ilara. The village, everyone is talking. I think you need to leave, just for a while. Let this all die down." The words hit her like a physical blow. The absolute worst fear she had harbored since childhood had finally materialized. Her husband, the man she loved, was casting her out because of the very thing she couldn't control. Without a word, she packed a small leather bag, her hands moving mechanically. She walked out of the only home she had ever known, stepping into the biting night air. She found an abandoned, rotting shack deep in the thicket past the river, far away from the judging eyes of Oakhaven. There, surrounded by damp wood and utter silence, the beloved girl of the village finally understood exactly how cruel the world could be. Ilara spent her days wandering the dense, unforgiving pine forests that bordered Oakhaven. She spoke only to the ravens and found a pathetic, hollow sort of comfort in the wind thrashing against the high canopy. But the loneliness clung to her skin like morning frost. She, the girl who had once been the heartbeat of the village, was now just a ghost haunting its edges. being thrown away by the exact people she grew up with, the people whose scraped knees she had bandaged, left a bleeding crater in her chest. She existed right on the edge of their vision, present but entirely invisible. Then, as the season turned, nature itself seemed to turn against Oakhaven. A brutal, relentless drought choked the life out of the territory. The once lush wheat fields turned into brittle gray dust. The deep, roaring river that powered the mills shrank down to a miserable, muddy trickle. The villagers could only stand on the cracked riverbanks, watching helplessly as their winter food stores dwindled down to nothing. But it wasn't just the thirst and the hunger that terrified them. It was the nights. Darkness no longer brought rest, it brought a suffocating dread. Strange, guttural shrieks echoed from the tree line. Unnatural shadows seemed to peel themselves off the cabin walls and move on their own, sending violent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened fishermen. Sleep became impossible. A thick, poisonous fog of panic settled over Oakhaven. Desperate, the village elders gathered under the rotting branches of the ancient oak tree. They had to do something before the terror tore the town apart. Gripped by fear, they made the trek up the mountain path to consult the seer, an ancient hermit who claimed to hear the whispers of the earth gods. Inside his suffocating cave, thick with the smell of burning sage, the seer listened. The old man finally spoke, his voice vibrating against the stone walls. "The earth is entirely out of balance," he rasped. "The gods are furious. Only an offering from a woman completely untouched, pure in the eyes of the old laws, can tip the scales back. Only she can bring the rain." But the seer's cloudy eyes darkened, hinting heavily that whoever made this offering might not survive it. Terrified of a mass panic, the elders swallowed that grim detail, choosing to keep the lethal risk to themselves. They dragged the entire village to a mandatory bonfire meeting that night. Faces illuminated by the frantic orange flames looked hollow and terrified. "Who will do this?" they murmured, their voices cracking. They desperately scoured the crowd for a maiden, but the harsh reality set in. There wasn't a single girl of age who remained untouched. The elders stood before the fire, completely defeated, declaring that they were out of options and the drought would simply have to take them all. The crowd erupted into terrified weeping. But then, a voice cut through the chaos. "What about Ilara?" a woman yelled from the back. "She never shared a bed with Caleb. She is entirely untouched." A massive, desperate realization washed over the crowd. The very thing that had made her an outcast, the secret that got her banished, was suddenly their only lifeline. "She can save us," they chanted, their earlier disgust completely overridden by their fear of starvation. With heavy, guilt-ridden chests, the elders marched into the dark woods toward Ilara's rotting shack. Their torches threw violent, twisting shadows against the trees, making the whole procession look like a funeral march. Ilara heard the crunch of their boots long before they knocked. When she opened the flimsy wooden door, the sight of the elders holding torches on her porch made her blood run cold. They didn't apologize for banishing her. They simply laid out the desperate situation, carefully leaving out the seer's warning about the extreme danger of the ritual. "You were always different, Ilara," the lead elder pleaded, his voice cracking. "Maybe this is why. Will you do this for us? Will you go to the peak?" Ilara stood in the doorway, staring at the desperate faces of the men who had cast her out like garbage. The betrayal still burned furiously in her throat. She could have slammed the door. She could have let them starve. But as she looked at them, she didn't see monsters. She just saw terrified, breaking people. A strange, anchoring calm washed over her. "I will go," she said, her voice dead steady. "For Oakhaven, I will do it." The elders sagged with massive relief, but they couldn't meet her eyes, thoroughly ashamed of the burden they were placing on an outcast. When the sun finally cracked over the horizon, Oakhaven was draped in a suffocating, tense silence. Today was the ritual. The elders, trailed by a handful of chosen villagers, walked solemnly up to Ilara's isolated shack. They carried the sacred items, bundles of sweet-smelling dried lavender, rare silver wheat, and a small, terrified white dove tied with a silk ribbon. Ilara hadn't slept a wink. She had spent the entire night warring with her own resentment and her deeply ingrained instinct to protect these people. When she stepped out onto the porch, she wore a simple, unadorned white linen gown. Her face was completely stripped of fear. She looked like a statue carved from salt, radiating a quiet, unshakable strength. The elders immediately bowed their heads, suddenly overwhelmed with a deep, crushing reverence for the girl they had thrown away. The lead elder stepped forward, his hands trembling as he held out the offerings. "Today you carry a weight none of us are strong enough to bear," he choked out, his eyes glassy. "You take our survival to the Skyreach cliffs." Ilara didn't hesitate. She took the heavy basket of offerings, her grip firm. "I am ready. I am doing this for whatever future we have left," she declared loudly, making sure every single villager hiding in the tree line heard her. Without looking back, she began the agonizing trek. She walked past the completely dead, cracked wheat fields, heading straight up the treacherous path to the Skyreach cliffs, the highest, deadliest drop in the territory, long rumored to be the only place where the earth touched the divine. The villagers trailed far behind her in absolute silence, a morbid, guilty procession honoring her terrifying bravery. When she reached the jagged edge of the cliff, the wind whipped her white gown violently. Ilara meticulously arranged the silver wheat and the lavender on the stone altar, just as the old text demanded. She released the white dove into the violent wind, raised her bare arms to the heavens, and began to sing. It wasn't just a chant, it was a guttural, earth-shaking melody that carried all the pain, rejection, and desperate hope of her entire life. Almost instantly, the bright morning sky violently turned black. Heavy, bruising clouds rolled in. The black clouds spiraled directly above Skyreach, forming a bruised, violent canopy. A ferocious gale tore across the precipice, whipping Ilara's white linen gown so fiercely it sounded like snapping ship sails. Yet, her guttural chant didn't waver for a second. It pierced straight through the deafening roar of the wind. The villagers watching from the safety of the foothills held their collective breath, their terror tangling with a desperate, suffocating awe. Then, without warning, the screaming wind just stopped. Absolute ringing silence crashed over the mountain. A single blinding shaft of golden sunlight ruptured the thick clouds, striking Ilara and the stone altar. In the next breath, an unseen, colossal force slammed directly into her chest. She collapsed violently onto the hard rock. A collective, horrified gasp echoed from the villagers below. But before the frantic elders could scramble up the treacherous, winding path to check if she was breathing, the sky finally broke. A heavy, warm drop of water hit the dry, cracked dust. Then another. Within seconds, a torrential, blinding downpour washed over Oakhaven. The parched earth drank furiously. The gods had answered. Down in the valley, people collapsed to their knees in the mud, weeping uncontrollably. Up on the wet, jagged stone of the cliff, Ilara gasped for air. She pushed herself up onto her trembling hands and knees, the torrential rain flattening her dark hair against her skull. Instantly, she felt entirely different. The crushing, heavy physical dread that had lived deep in her bones for over a decade was simply gone. She ran shaking hands down her stomach, pressing frantically against the soaked linen. She froze, the breath catching in her throat. The duality that had cursed her, the anatomical anomaly that had driven her into the rotting woods to die, had vanished entirely. The divine strike hadn't taken her life, it had fundamentally rewritten her flesh. She was entirely whole. She was solely the woman she had always fought to be in the dark. Tears mixed with the heavy rain streaming down her face, not tears of residual pain, but a fierce, explosive relief that shook her entire frame. She turned toward the bewildered elders who were finally cresting the ridge. "It's gone!" she screamed, her voice echoing wildly off the canyon walls. "The curse is gone!" The elders froze, staring at her in absolute shock, which quickly melted into pure, terrified reverence. They didn't just help her down the mountain, they escorted her like a living deity. When Alara finally stepped back into the village square, Oak Haven was delirious with chaotic joy. The same people who had spat at her shadow days ago now rushed forward, desperate to just touch the hem of her ruined wet gown. The crowd suddenly parted, leaving a wide circle in the mud. Caleb stood in the freezing rain, his clothes plastered to his skin, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. He looked completely shattered by the weight of his own guilt. He walked slowly toward her, ignoring the hundreds of unblinking eyes locked on them. He didn't offer a quick, quiet apology. He dropped straight to his knees in the deep mud, right at her bare feet. "I was a coward," Caleb choked out, his voice cracking violently over the sound of the rain. "You carried the weight of the entire world, and I let you carry it completely alone. I don't deserve your shadow, Alara, but I am begging for your forgiveness." The anger that had kept Alara warm in the woods had washed away with the storm. She reached down, gripping his calloused hands. She pulled Caleb to his feet, dragging him into a fierce embrace. "We leave the past in the dirt," she whispered into his shoulder. Caleb didn't just take her back to their cabin, he demanded a second wedding. He wanted to marry her out in the open, knowing exactly who she was, without a single shadow or suffocating secret standing between them. 3 days later, the village threw a massive celebration that made their first wedding look like a quiet supper. Bonfires roared so high they seemed to aggressively challenge the newly cleared stars. Fiddles and heavy drums pounded through the damp pine trees until the early dawn. Oak Haven didn't just celebrate the return of the river, they celebrated a brutal, ugly lesson learned. The girl they had thrown away into the dark woods had been the only one capable of bringing back the light. Alara sat beside Caleb, watching the firelight dance across the faces of her neighbors. She finally belonged. The painful truth of Oak Haven's survival became a permanent legend. Never discard the broken or the misunderstood, because the very hands you violently push away might be the only ones that can pull you from the abyss.